Hello, podcast listeners. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, I encourage you to share the show. Spread the show. Share this episode. It's how we grow. Make sure you're subscribed. Give us a good rating and review. It really helps us climb the charts. Today, it's just you and me back one-on-one for another coffee history, another installment of American coffee history. We're picking up right where we left off, and I absolutely love this series. So we're going to wrap it up today and bring American coffee history right up to the modern time. So let's dive in to today's episode. In our last edition of American coffee history, we left off in the middle 1900s. America was helping to wrap up a Second World War, and soldiers on all sides, if they were lucky, were being fueled by coffee. Maxwell House instant coffee filled the ration kits of every American soldier that departed for World War II. And when they came home, those boys were not ready to give up their Joe. Coffee was here to stay. But coffee wasn't just being completely infused into military culture alone. Despite wartime rationing of Java, maybe even amplified by it, in fact, coffee came roaring back across the home front in the mid-1900s, post-World War United States. And the coffee industry recognized this. The American coffee business model quickly began to take shape. Produce cheap, affordable, bulk coffee for the nuclear American family. Convenience is key. Only pre-ground or instant will do. Otherwise, you might as well be living in the Stone Age with Barney and Fred. And when it came to advertising, boy, oh boy.
Because it's good ground Maxwell House. Maxwell House coffee is good to the last drop. Enjoy the rich, fresh taste of Maxwell House coffee. The ground coffee that tastes as good as it smells every time. Maxwell House.
It is just so fascinating. Interestingly, they relied heavily on brand-facing advertisements. Only our brand can satisfy.
Okay, buddy, what do you think of Wilkins coffee? I never tasted it.
Coffee advertising was utterly unique during this time period.
In the mood for hot coffee? When you are, nothing else will satisfy. Coffee has a flavor, an aroma, a deep-down satisfying goodness all its own. And our coffee has something extra, the care with which we brew and serve it. You'll enjoy the show more while you're enjoying steaming hot coffee. Come and get yours now.
We understand so little about coffee today. This podcast is a testament to that. But back then, they were focusing on totally different aspects of the brew. Coffee that tastes as good as it smells. Coffee that satisfies completely. Coffee was still almost this mystical, magical elixir in modern American culture. We did not understand it, and advertisers hadn't quite settled on how to best pitch it and sell the bean. Some of the ads are just downright sexist and mean-spirited, targeting and challenging a woman's worth compared to how her coffee is received by her husband and friends.
Harold, is the coffee all right?
Mm-mm.
You mean it's as bad as yesterday?
Mm-hmm.
No improvement at all?
Mm-mm.
Harold, don't just shake your head. You've got to tell me what's wrong with the coffee.
Bad taste.
These ads are truly unrecognizable compared to modern coffee commercials. Now, mainstream American culture was saturated with coffee, as we just saw, but just like in the ancient world, just like in the coffee houses of ancient Turkey and all throughout history, just like we've discussed in previous episodes of this series, counterculture also flocked to coffee houses. In the middle 1900s America, a new modern generation of coffee houses began to spring up, serving as purveyors of alternative art like jazz, poetry, and more. Just like all throughout history, coffee houses serve as a place for debate, as well as the epicenter for cultural movements that defy convention. Quoting from GoCoffeeGo.com, quote, "At coffee shops in San Francisco's North Beach and in New York's Greenwich Village, the poets and intellectuals known as Beatniks hang out, drink espresso, and have lively philosophical and political discussions that challenge the traditional ways of the 1950s. These bohemians are the forerunners of the cultural, political, and sexual revolution to come in the 1960s that will change the world forever. Still to this day, these historic coffee shops, as well as their counterparts throughout the United States, attract modern-day free thinkers who come together over a cup of coffee and move our society forward." End quote. And aside from the cultural explosion of coffee in the 1950s, there was something else to come out of this time, something that we've discussed on this show before. You see, doctors and scientists began to study coffee and began to study the health effects of coffee. And a lot of the studies that came out of the 1950s on coffee came to the conclusion that coffee was bad for you. They linked it to all types of diseases, multiple types of cancers, mood disturbances, behavioral issues. Coffee was viewed as a vice during this time. Now, interestingly, there's been a lot of work on this front. We know that this was a time when doctors were recommending that pregnant women could smoke. People were drinking 3 martinis with lunch. People were not exercising or walking. And apparently you can account for a lot of those factors and kind of work the math into the studies. You've heard Dr. Sanjeev talking about coming back and adjusting these studies for health risks like that. Another factor of coffee in the 1950s was post-World War II was when we started to introduce these heavy chemical pesticides across the world, not just here in our big ag systems, but across the world. And before we really began to regulate them, that really came into place later in the 1980s, 1990s. We began to ban some of the worst pesticides, many of them used on coffee. So I'd imagine that the lax standards and the unknown health effects of all the chemicals we were putting on our crops may have also contributed to those 1950s studies. But as coffee was studied more and more over the coming decades, different populations, eventually adding up to the most studied food on the planet, the evidence is overwhelming, and those old studies are truly being looked at with quite a bit of scrutiny, although still cited by many people. For instance, the link to breast cancer, which is something that Sanjeev Chopra has kind of debunked on this podcast. But very, very interesting. This is where coffee started to really get its bad name. And also when coffee alternatives started to spring up. You know, if you were having trouble with coffee, someone's trying to sell you an alternative. And a lot of these companies were springing on that, demonizing coffee and trying to push as much as they could of their coffee alternative.
If you were caught in the middle of traffic, or if you just saved yourself from being drawn out to sea by the undertow, you'd have a right to feel nervous and jumpy and jittery. But when that nervousness is due to little things, when you jump because somebody speaks to you suddenly, when you're ready to blow up at the mere sound of the neighbor's piano, then it's time you looked into the cause of that jumpiness. For it might be something you could easily remedy, something as simple as giving up coffee, perhaps. Although there are many people who can drink coffee without becoming nervous and jittery, there are many others who can't. So if you suspect coffee upset your nerves, switch to Postum. For Postum contains no caffeine or any other stimulant that could possibly set your nerves on edge.
Many of these coffee alternatives I think you'll recognize, and there's many alternatives out there today. There's never been more, I'd wager. But try as all these companies might to pry coffee out of American society, it simply wasn't going to happen. However, there is another interesting, distinct shift in the history of coffee that occurred in the early 1970s. As opposed to promoting a brand's superiority on vague claims like better taste or fully satisfying, as if somehow the brand logo or the packaging that it comes in gives it its flavor and body. Instead, advertisers started to focus on the origins of their beans.
To the people of Colombia, South America, the sun is not just a fair weather friend. All year round, it keeps the mountain air as mild as spring. For the coffee trees of Juan Valdez, it is the best climate in the world. The branches grow strong and full, and fragrant with flowers, till the green berries appear. Tall guamos trees filter the sun as the coffee beans grow delicious with flavor until they are ripe. Then, to keep the flavor pure, the beans are washed and dried in the sun. To grow coffee this good, you need the Colombian sun. But to make it, all you need is 100% Colombian coffee.
In the 1970s, one of the most iconic and recognizable characters in coffee history was born. His name is Juan Valdez, a fictional Colombian coffee farmer who's a loving father and apparently a very proud owner of a donkey who can often be seen being kept in tow.
In Colombia, South America, when Juan Valdez plants a coffee tree, he works on it for 5 years before it grows its first bean. And even when the tree is mature, he must still work every day just to get the single pound of coffee each tree produces in a whole year. There are easier ways to grow coffee, but Juan is not growing the easiest coffee in the world. He's growing the richest.
Now, as silly as these commercials may look to some of us now, they were revolutionary for the time, both for the coffee advertising world and for the country of Colombia. And as the coffee consumers, people were beginning to associate locales with different flavors and qualities of coffee for the first time ever. This, in my opinion, was the very first signs of the birth of the educated coffee consumer. Although we didn't even yet wrap our heads around production methods or flavor profiles or even different roasting methods, we were beginning to associate the coffee we liked with something other than just a corporation or a brand name. We began to learn about coffee, how it was produced, and where it came from. And like I said, this was huge for Colombia. There are so many incredible coffee-producing nations in the world, but having just been to Colombia, I can personally attest to the stunning amount of passion and the deep affinity they have for the coffee plant, and also the incredible amount of regenerative agriculture work that goes on there down in Colombia. And these ads, they were kind of the beginning of that. If you remember back to the interviews with the Colombian farmers, not many years after this very ad was launching, and when there were still Juan Valdez ads running strong, Oscar was granted that loan, that regenerative farming scholarship by that German bank. And that German bank's interest was piqued by the Colombian coffee industry. And you can still find Juan Valdez brand coffee shops all over the place down in Colombia today. It's incredible how the dominoes of history fall, even if you're looking at history through the lens of coffee. And now, where are we left? Consumers continued to educate themselves, continued to become more and more selective about their coffee and how it's produced. The 21st century has given rise to an incredible wave of specialty coffees, and it's completely reshaped the industry. Farmers and producers are telling the story behind the creation of their beans, and a farmer who puts in the extra care and effort can become certified in things like organic, things like rainforest-friendly practices, and now these farmers can fetch a better price for those beans and provide a better life for their families and their communities. Truly, as the consumer has evolved, so has the industry as a whole. Coffee companies have evolved as well, with health-focused coffee companies like Purity Coffee incorporating coffee into a wellness-focused routine and pushing the boundaries of science by producing more and more health-conscious beans. The ketogenic and fitness community has flocked to coffee for this reason. Health scientists and nutritionists and athletes are now all taking note of the humble cup of Joe. And the truth is, there's never been more competition for coffee out there in the modern world. With energy drinks and energy shots, kombucha, and literally aisles full of various beverage offerings. But aside from good old water itself, one drink reigns supreme, especially here in America. One drink has been absolutely ubiquitous in the United States culture, despite numerous setbacks and efforts by others. None of those artificial, dyed, sugar-laden drinks can ever compete with the surprisingly patriotic brew, known as coffee. I hope you enjoyed this exploration with me today in modern American coffee history. What a fun episode it was. I look forward to bringing you more coffee history, probably going back a little bit further, maybe back into the ancient world again. Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate all of you subscribers. Please share the show, as I said. It really does help us out. Stay tuned for more Dr. Coffee. Dr. Sanjeev Chopra is coming back on the show. We've got some really exciting stuff in the works. Thank you all again. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. This is Jordan Rivers saying, have an extraordinary day, everybody. Bye-bye.